Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums here at the University of Mary Washington, and it is my pleasure to welcome our audience here in Monroe Hall on the UMW campus, as well as those joining us online for the 31st Annual James Monroe Lecture. I am also pleased to let you know that we have not only members of the staffs of the James Monroe Museum and the papers of James Monroe here tonight in the audience, but we also have with us staff from the sister institution that we work with so well, James Monroe's Highland, including Sarah Von Harper, the Executive Director, and so we're pleased that our colleagues have traveled long and far to get here, and there's some other folks I know who've traveled even farther to come and be a part of this tonight. The James Monroe Museum gratefully acknowledges support for this year's lecture and for our other public programs from the following: Fredericksburg Savings Charitable Foundation, the Friends of the James Monroe Museum, the H. Stewart Jones Charitable Trust, the Paul and Jane Jones Trust, and the University of Mary Washington's Department of History and American Studies. Would you join me in giving some applause to our sponsors? We're very fortunate this evening in that we will be hearing from Dr. Joanne B. Freeman, Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University, whose specialty is the politics and the political culture of the revolutionary and early national periods of American history. Her research and her writing on dueling as an aspect of the political process inspired the song 10 Dual Commandments in a popular Broadway musical about Alexander Hamilton. Perhaps you've heard of it. Some of us don't get out as much and maybe you didn't hear it. After receiving a BA in English from Pomona College, Dr. Freeman earned an MA and a PhD in history from the University of Virginia. Her 2001 book, Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic, won the Best Book Award from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. And her edited volume, Alexander Hamilton Writings, was one of the Atlantic Monthly's 10 best books of 2001. Her latest book, The Field of Blood, Congressional Violence in Antebellum America, explores physical violence in the U.S. Congress between 1830 and the Civil War, and what it suggests about the institution of Congress, the nature of American sectionalism, the challenges of a young nation's developing democracy, and the long-standing roots of the Civil War. And by a happy coincidence, copies of Affairs of Honor and The Field of Blood are available for sale right here in this building tonight after the lecture and at any time at the James Monroe Museum store. So I wanted to make sure you're aware of that. A fellow of the Society of American Historians, Freeman has won fellowships from, among others, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Dirksen Congressional Research Center, the American Historical Association, and the Library of Congress. She is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and was rated one of the nation's top young historians in 2005. Dr. Freeman's articles have appeared in a wide range of academic journals, including the William and Mary Quarterly, Journal of the Early Republic, Journal of Policy History, and the Yale Law Journal, among others. She has written op-ed pieces for the New York Times and has appeared in a host of documentaries on PBS and the History Channel and radio programs for NPR and the BBC. She's done extensive work in the realm of public history, including co-curating museum exhibitions, acting as an historical consultant for documentary filmmakers, and giving frequent public lectures at venues such as the Smithsonian's Museum of American History, the National Gallery of Art, and Colonial Williamsburg. She's also worked extensively with high school history teachers and students in workshops, lectures, and symposia around the nation. In the last 2 years, she's been a historical consultant for the National Park Service in the reconstruction of the Alexander Hamilton Grange National Memorial. And Dr. Freeman also participated today in a wonderful discussion with students and faculty here at the University of Mary Washington as part of the Talking History series, discussing her work and the history profession generally. And we're really glad that she had the opportunity to have some of that interaction with our students. One of the goals declared in the preamble to the United States Constitution is to ensure domestic tranquility. As we have seen in our contemporary political discourse, and we'll learn from Dr. Freeman tonight, the politics of our nation from the very beginning have often been anything but tranquil. During a long and varied career in public service, James Monroe was himself often at the center of heated political debates, some of which came close to ending in potentially deadly confrontations. So with that all in mind, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joanne B. Freeman for Dirty, Nasty Politics in James Monroe's America.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm extremely pleased to be here this evening, and indeed I'm going to be discussing a topic that I've been studying for a very long time that has somehow become more topical recently, and that is dirty, nasty politics. And this evening I'll be focusing on James Monroe's America. Now, my first book, Affairs of Honor, was about what it felt like to be a national politician in the fraught and often nasty partisan 1790s, which was the first decade under the Constitution. The book that I've just completed, which is The Field of Blood, talks about physical violence in the US Congress in the first half of the 19th century. And I'll just sum up the book by saying there was a lot of violence in Congress in the first half of the 19th century. And it just came out a few weeks ago, actually, in September. I will add that I started it 17 years ago, and it was much less timely 17 years ago when I started writing about political violence. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about dirty, nasty politics in early America. I'm going to do that not by being sort of up high and looking down, but I want to talk about real-life, ground-level politics in early America. And I'm going to do this in two parts. So first, I'll explore some of the reasons for this state of extreme politics, trying to recreate some sense of what it really felt like to be a national politician in the 1790s. And then I'm going to look at some specific examples of dirty, nasty politics and how, at the time, they made sense. So let's start with some of the reasons for the period's intense political atmosphere. Now, I think maybe more than anything else, to really understand politics in the earliest years of the American Republic, you have to first understand the political climate. And I think maybe the best way to sum up that climate is to say that the 1790s specifically, and the early years of the Republic generally, was a period of political experimentation and a lot of anxiety. So let's look at the experimentation side of that equation. Now, given our modern vantage point and the fact that our Constitution has lasted for a very long time, I think it's really easy to forget how experimental our government was when it was created. It was created in a world of monarchies, and people at the time referred to it and used the word experiment when they talked about it. The Constitution created a republic in a world that was largely controlled by monarchs and monarchies. And although the founders looked back to republics of the ancient world for guidance, in essence, they were creating something new in the modern world. So it was untested, it was untried, they assumed it was fragile. Compared with other governments of the time, the Constitution did all kinds of strange things. It created an elected national executive with limited powers, so there wasn't a monarch. The government was sort of strangely divided. It was a federal government where states could pass their own laws and the national government could pass its own laws, and somehow or other this would all work out. This experimental new government made public opinion, the voting public, extremely important. There were frequent elections, there was frequent rotation in office, and there was full direct representation. All of these things, to a certain degree, were experimental, and there was really no telling if they would work. Would this new government hold the states together? Would it stand up against powerful empires and monarchies the world over? Or would it collapse into a state of anarchy with 13 states warring against each other and ultimately be swallowed up by England or France or Spain? Or equally possible, would the new nation fall back into what was familiar and essentially devolve into becoming a monarchy? There was absolutely no telling. Anything could happen. Nothing was foreordained. And I really think to understand this period, you have to look through 18th century eyes and really see how frightening and unstable and unexpected the period's politics seemed to people at the time. In essence, to understand the politics of this period, and this is probably true of history generally, you really have to allow for contingency, for the idea that anything could happen. And there's a great example of this in a document from the period that a lot of people overlook, but to me it's really revealing, and it's got a real punchline at the end of it that really gives you a sense of how uncertain things were at this moment in time. And it's written by Alexander Hamilton. And it's just after the Constitutional Convention. And he was a delegate at the convention, he leaves the convention, and he sits down and writes a little memo to himself. This was for no other reason, but he was kind of musing on paper about what he thought would happen next, what will happen to this new government. And it's a couple pages long, and it's very lawyerly, and he kind of proceeds, what do I think is going to happen? So first he says, okay, well maybe George Washington will become president, that would be logical, and if that happens, that might be good, because the states probably will trust more power being in the hands of George Washington. People trust George Washington. And he'll probably put good people in office, and people will trust those people. That would be excellent, too. But if Washington doesn't become president, Hamilton thought, things aren't going to go so well. The Union might collapse. Maybe foreign countries will sweep in and swallow up some of the states. Probably the nation will go down. And the punchline is at the end of this document. After describing the sort of apocalyptic end of the Republic, he writes, quote, "This seems to be the most likely result." Right? He just left the convention. Like, he just worked to create the Constitution. He goes home and he says, I don't really think it's going to last, but hey, I'll give it a try. You know, that's a shocking document. Then it really captures contingency. You can hear that sense of contingency in the comments of people at the time. So for example, here's James Madison at the launching of the new government in 1789, quote, "We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." Here's George Washington that same year. He wrote, "I walk on untrodden ground." And here's a senator from the period, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, who had the same exact feeling at the same exact time. He wrote in his diary, "The whole world is a shell, and we tread on hollow ground every step." Those are three remarkably similar statements. It's almost like there was a little memo that went around that was like, hey, use the shaky ground metaphor when you refer to the new government. Clearly, they all have very similar feelings about the state of affairs in the new nation. A feeling of not knowing where they were going, a feeling that the ground was going to break under their feet at any moment. The new nation had a constitutional framework, but no one knew what kind of nation would emerge from it. The Constitution is a very basic framework that left the real nature of governance, the tone and the realities of the political process, to be figured out when the government was already in motion. So a lot of the anxiety of the 1790s and what ends up being dirty, nasty politics of the 1790s was inspired by this process of figuring out what this new unstable nation, this republic, was supposed to be. The stakes of this political experiment seemed very high to the people involved in it, because they assumed that they were deciding for all time whether a republic was feasible in the modern world. And I don't mean to be Alexander Hamilton biased, but he offers a couple sentences that I think capture this really well. And they actually are from the first paragraph of the first Federalist essay. I will confess that almost every class I teach, I read this paragraph, and so I'm going to inflict it on you right now, but you'll see. It says something. Okay, so these are Hamilton's words. "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. The crisis at which we are arrived may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, and a wrong election of the part we shall act may deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind." Now that communicates a sense of responsibility, right? A sense of high stakes. These people assumed that they were deciding, possibly for all time, whether or not you could put a bunch of men, and they were at this point were all men, in a room and have them calmly create a just form of government and then put it in motion through a calm, deliberate process of ratification. National politicians really believed that they were exemplars before the eyes of the world. And if you just think about what that meant, think about how self-conscious that must have made them about everything that they did. Plus, as the first national office holders under the new Constitution, everything that they did established a precedent. And there's a great diary account of this taking place in the Senate in the very first weeks of the government, when the Senate is trying to figure out, what do you do to inaugurate a national executive who is not a king? Right? We don't know what this is. We don't know what do you do? We don't want to be monarchical. We don't want to look like whatever it is that they're doing in Great Britain, but what does that mean? No one knew. So they started with basics. When the president enters the Senate to take the oath of office, should the senators stand and treat him like a superior, or sit and treat him like an equal? Now, the risk here was that they didn't want to make Washington look like a king or feel like a king, which maybe if they stood up they might do. They didn't want the Senate, though, to look like a House of Lords, which maybe if they sat in front of the president, it might do. So they have this debate. Uh-oh, what do we do? One senator pipes up that during the king's speech in Parliament, the House of Lords sits and the House of Commons stands. And this clearly, when you're reading the diary entry describing this, clearly it felt very important to the Senate, right? And you could almost hear the Senate go, House of Lords sitting, House of Commons standing. But then someone in the room made this brilliant discovery. The House of Commons stood because they had no chairs, because they were in the House of Lords. And you can almost hear the whole Senate go, oh. At this moment, a messenger from the House came to the door of the Senate. This raised a new question. Should this messenger from the House be allowed into the Senate? What was the symbolism of letting a messenger from the House into the Senate? What might this mean down the road? What did it say about the relationship between the two houses? And the person describing this diary entry says at the end of all this, quote, "This is an endless business." Everything said a president. Multiply that episode by thousands, and you get a sense of what it was like to govern in those early years. People were really figuring things out one step at a time, and there was no modern nation that they could precisely copy as a guide. National politicians were literally making it up as they went along, and they knew it. Now, on the one hand, there was something really exhilarating about this sense of unknown possibilities. As Thomas Paine wrote in 1776, could America be happy after becoming independent? Quote, "As happy as she pleases. She hath a blank sheet to write upon." So that's kind of exciting, right? Endless possibilities. But there was something terrifying about this too, because the government was so new and weak and experimental that there was no telling what might destroy it. Even the slightest mistake might have a devastating impact. So every action and decision had to be considered and reconsidered to avoid making that one fatal move that might destroy the republic and push it into either monarchy or anarchy. And there's a wonderful story that communicates the degree to which this was really true, that the sense that one slip, one stupid decision, and the whole thing might fail. And it comes from the diary of a Pennsylvania senator. He's the one who actually had that wonderful account, this is an endless business. His name is William Maclay, and he was part of the first Congress. He has an amazing, amazing diary. He writes his dreams, he writes the snack foods that other senators are eating around him. He writes that he hears another senator whisper to another senator, "John Adams needs his wig dressed." I mean, everything is in this diary, so it's a wonderful diary. And Maclay was the kind of person who thought that this new republic should be very virtuously simple and straightforward. He really detested all the pomp and ceremony of old world monarchies, and he was extremely afraid, given America's colonial past, that the new nation was almost destined to just slip right back into becoming a monarchy. So he tells this story in his diary, and it takes place in 1791, and he was invited to a dinner party where President Washington was going to be a guest. Now, Maclay revered Washington, to the point that he doesn't use his name in his diary. He just refers to him as the first man. He doesn't know what to do in Washington's presence. He goes to the party, and as he describes in his diary, he enters the room, and of course, who is standing by the door? George Washington. So Maclay doesn't know what to do. He's discombobulated. He describes that in his diary, he basically panicked. He said he made a bow, and then he writes in his diary, it was a bad bow. It was an ugly bow. I didn't bow the right way in front of George Washington. And then he thinks, I have to get out of here because I don't know what I'm doing. It's George Washington. And he sees an empty seat across the room, and he sets out for the empty seat. And he takes a few steps, and then Washington gestures to him and said, Senator Maclay, why don't you come here and sit by me? Okay. Maclay's reaction here is key. He stops in the middle of the room, and as he explains in his diary, what would be the politically correct thing to do right now that's good for the Republic? Because if I turn around and take the seat, I'll be kowtowing to the president, which might make him feel like a monarch, which might make him act like a monarch, which might make him become a monarch, and it'll be the end of the Republic. Think about the logic there, right? I better not accept this seat because it shall destroy the Republic. Right? That's extreme. But there was no telling what kind of a person a president would be. So what does Maclay do? He walked away. He did not take the seat. He goes and sits across the room, does what he considers to be, the properly sort of patriotic thing to do. I will say that later in the evening, he gets to sit next to George Washington, who serves him wine. And so the story has a happy ending. He gets his George Washington moment. But still, think about the assumption on Maclay's part. He is worrying about the national political repercussions of accepting Washington's offer to take a seat. That gives you some idea of the level of self-consciousness and anxiety that I'm talking about. So the new nation's mere survival was an enormous ongoing anxiety throughout this entire period, which led to a second related fear. America didn't exist in isolation. There was a larger world to worry about. Would this new nation be strong enough to survive in this world of empires and monarchies? And without a monarch of our own, would we ever be taken seriously by any other nation? And there's a wonderful example of this as well, this mentality that takes place in the Senate in 1789 during the debate over the proper title for America's new national executive. There had never been that kind of a national executive before, so important question, what do we call him? And there are all of these various titles, His Elective Majesty, His Elective Highness. They're really trying, right? He's elected, yet he's kind of like a king. Finally, someone said, President of the United States, which entirely exasperated and alarmed Vice President John Adams. He's presiding over the Senate. He wanted something like His Elective Highness, which he thought was a nice compromise title. So Adams he speaks out against this title, and he says, President of the United States. Heads of cricket clubs are called president. What will the common people of foreign countries, what will the sailors and soldiers say? George Washington, President of the United States? They will despise him to all eternity. Americans assumed that other nations were hovering over the new republic, sneering at its littleness and basically licking their chops. So, another big fear. Could the nation hold its own? Who were its friends? Who were its enemies? And what were the implications of making friends or enemies of different countries? The American government was so new and untried that it hadn't yet established its real tone, its national character. And people feared that if the nation got too close to one particular foreign nation, its culture and politics might end up contaminating America's national character in the country's formative years. So you can begin to see, given all of this that I'm unfolding here, why the natural result of all of this would be anxiety, and not a low-level hum of anxiety. Throughout the 1790s, there was a kind of crisis mentality, and it had a powerful effect on the period's politics because it seemed to justify extreme actions. If the survival of the republic was at stake, then politics becomes a no-holds-barred, do-or-die proposition. This crisis mentality helped make politics in this period particularly dirty and nasty. So let's look at a little bit of dirty, nasty, desperate politics. What are we talking about? Now, on the most basic level of all, we're talking about a clash between two political orientations, the Federalists and the Republicans. Now, you'll notice I said orientations. I didn't use the word party, and that's for good reason. We assume that the core of American politics is a national two-party system. In the early republic, people thought the precise opposite. They assumed that established, organized national political parties were a sign that something was wrong. They assumed that a political party was a group of men working to advance their own selfish interests and ambitions and not the interests of the nation at large. So organized national political parties were bad, period. So because people at the time didn't believe in an established party system and because they didn't like organized parties, I basically try to avoid using that word when I talk about the period, when I teach about the period, because it brings so much modern baggage with it. So instead of party, they often said things like, Mr. Jefferson and his particular friends, meaning the Republicans, or Mr. Hamilton and his particular friends, meaning the Federalists. Now, of course, there were major ideological differences between the Federalists and the Republicans, but regardless of these differences, both of these alliances shared one basic assumption. Federalist or Republican, they assumed that they and their friends represented the American people, they represented the nation's best interests, and those other people, so different from you, well, they clearly were thinking only of themselves and not of the nation. They were a selfish party that had to be destroyed or they would destroy the fragile new nation. And here's a great example of this. It takes place in 1800. And there's a Connecticut Republican, his name is Gideon Granger, and he writes to Thomas Jefferson, and he says, you know, a Federalist came up to me recently and said, and this is a paraphrase, Mr. Granger, I have nothing against you personally, but you must be destroyed. So clearly, one general assumption of the period was that once one or the other of these alliances or parties was gone, things would calm down, they would go back to normal. And here we begin to get at the kind of thinking that made the period's politics so intense and often nasty. Because if you really believe that the other side is going to destroy the nation, then you really felt justified in doing whatever it took to destroy them, even if you cross a lot of lines and broke a lot of rules doing it. It was for the good of the republic, so it was allowed, it was even necessary. Not to act would be the real sin. So in essence, faced with fears of anarchy, monarchy, disunion, or even civil war, national politicians stretched the rules. They did things that they would never have done under normal circumstances because the crisis of the moment seemed to demand it. If they failed to take extreme action, everything might fall. Even organizing into something that looked suspiciously like a party might be acceptable if it was a temporary measure to save the day. So ironically, by preparing themselves to defend the republic, both sides began to look threateningly party-like, which fueled this sense of crisis. So over the course of the 1790s, Federalists and Republicans each did basically whatever it took to destroy the other. And I'm going to offer a Jeffersonian example and a Hamiltonian example because I shall be fair, right? I shall be bipartisan. So a Jeffersonian example. In 1799, America was in the midst of an almost but not quite war with France, which appropriately enough comes to be known as the Quasi-War, which I always think is kind of an anticlimactic name for a war, but it's the Quasi-War. And the nation seemed to be lining up behind the Federalists to fight France. And a presidential election was just around the corner. So Thomas Jefferson, who's a fan of France and no fan of the Federalists, was horrified for any number of reasons. So he comes up with what he clearly believed to be a brilliant idea, a wonderful way to destroy the Federalists and save the Republic. As he explained in a letter to his friend James Madison, and I'm going to offer you really bad paraphrasing here, so this is not exactly what Jefferson wrote. He said to Madison, "Remember those notes you took at the Constitutional Convention when you were there as a delegate? Those really detailed notes about what everybody at the convention said? The ones that you swore upon your honor not to publish during the lifetime of any participant? because your notes could be used as political fodder against people who had spoken their honest feelings at this confidential convention? Publish them. Now, to Jefferson, this made sense, because he thought that Madison's notes would reveal to the public that the Federalists were really monarchists trying to destroy the Republic. And that's particularly true because Alexander Hamilton, during a 6-hour speech at the convention, had praised the British monarchy as the best government on the face of the earth. So Madison's notes might destroy Hamilton and his particular friends with one blow. And Jefferson admits in this letter to Madison, he says, yes, I know I'm asking you to break your word, you promised not to publish them, but it's for the national good. As he put it in that letter, quote, the arguments against publishing the notes will be personal, those in favor of it, moral. It's like, I know your personal character will suffer and people will think you're a cheater, but you'll be doing the morally correct thing. So Jefferson's basically saying to Madison, sacrifice the personal, violate your personal promise, sacrifice your reputation for the moral, for the good of the nation. Desperate situations require desperate measures. Now, I will say on Madison's behalf, he did not publish his notes, so he stood up for his promise. But as I said before, Jefferson's not alone in such thinking. A lot of people use similar logic in this period. So here's the counter-Hamiltonian example. During the presidential election of 1800, Hamilton was equally desperate. Something had to be done, or Thomas Jefferson might become president and destroy the Republic. So Hamilton's idea, in the midst of the election, he writes to New York Governor John Jay and urges him to change the rules for choosing presidential electors in the middle of the election, right? It's like, the way it's going now, it might be bad, so just change the rules. Knowing that Jay would protest, Hamilton explained that when national survival was involved, rules had to be broken. As he put it, because of the extraordinary nature of the crisis, it will not do to be over-scrupulous. It is easy to sacrifice the substantial interests of society by a strict adherence to ordinary rules. They ought not to hinder the taking of a legal and constitutional step to prevent an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics from getting possession of the helm of the state. Now, to John Jay's credit, he ignored the request. He actually read the letter, and he wrote on the bottom of it a note to himself that said something like, this does not become me to do, it is for purely party purposes or something. So thank you, John Jay. So basically, Madison and Jay are these quiet little voices of reason in the crazy, anxious period that we're talking about here. So political conflict was extreme because the stakes were so high and the times felt so desperate. Political conflict was also personal in several senses of the word. In one sense, conflict was personal because the political arena was smaller. So this was a world where, to cite one specific example, a Massachusetts Federalist could write to a complete stranger in Connecticut, who happened to be named Mr. Smith, and ask Mr. Smith who, throughout the entire state of Connecticut, was receiving letters from Republican congressmen. Now, not only is that an amazing request, Mr. Smith knew the answer, right? He knew who was getting letters from Republican congressmen. Word got around, again, more intimate political world. Not only that, but he knew that one man not only received letters from Republican congressmen, but he pretended that he hadn't received them by hiding them. Proof, as Smith said, that that fellow was both a Republican and a liar. So this is a personal political world, in part because of the small scale of things. But perhaps most important, politics was personal because in the period before politician was really an established profession, and before people could fight as anonymous members of political parties, personal reputation was key. Men gained office on the basis of personal reputation. They formed alliances when they trusted it, and they assumed that they would earn it by accepting high office. So this was a personal politics where reputation mattered a lot, not only because it gained you power, but equally important because without structured national political parties, your reputation was sometimes the only way people could figure out your politics and decide whether or not to trust you. So you might say you're a Federalist or a Republican, but people often veered in their politics depending on interests. Reputation mattered for a lot. And here I have a James Monroe, a specially prepared James Monroe example to offer you. And it takes place in 1797. And at the time, Alexander Hamilton believed that James Monroe had leaked information about an adulterous affair that Hamilton had with a woman named Maria Reynolds in 1792. So he really thinks somehow or other Monroe leaked the information, it came out, this is bad, Hamilton's reputation is bad, it's blowing up, it's becoming a mess. So Hamilton is outraged, and he goes to Monroe's house to demand an explanation. He says he's bringing a friend, and in other words, that's a second, right? I'm coming to your house, I want to talk to you about this, and I'm bringing a friend. Monroe would have known immediately on getting that letter that this was moving into dual territory, right? So Monroe also gets a friend to be there to represent him, and luckily Monroe's friend, like a good second in an almost duel, records their conversation. So these two men really didn't like each other. Hamilton and Monroe really didn't like each other. And you can tell that immediately when you read the conversation that they have. Things didn't start out very well. Hamilton was pretty much a lawyerly thinker. And he wanted to rehearse the entire history of their controversy, step by step. So he's like, it all began with this, and then this, and then this, and he's going on and on at length. And Monroe clearly is just frustrated. And he keeps interrupting. I know this. I was there. I was doing it with you. Can we get to the point? Hamilton responds to the interruptions by going back and beginning again, right? I will now tell you, let me, as I was saying, so you can see the conversation is getting angrier and angrier. Hamilton is getting redder and redder. Monroe is getting icier and icier. Finally, Hamilton just bluntly accuses Monroe of leaking the information. When Monroe says no, he did not, Hamilton says, and his word choice here is key, he says, quote, "This, as your representation, is totally false." Now, he's not using the L word. He's not saying you're a liar. That would have been like instant duel territory, right? Liar and coward, there are some words that almost demand a duel. He's being very careful. This, as your representation, is totally false. But Monroe hears exactly what Hamilton is saying and responds by saying, "Do you say I represented falsely? Are you saying that I'm a liar? You are a scoundrel." Okay, scoundrel is another dueling word. Things are getting ugly. So Hamilton responds, as any man of honor would, to being called a scoundrel. He says, "I will meet you like a gentleman," meaning I'm ready to duel. And Monroe says, "I am ready, get your pistols." And they're separated, and they're quieted down, and this does not become a duel. They basically write letters back and forth to each other, but they're so worried about their reputations. They're, both of them, essentially willing to risk their lives for their reputations in that moment. Now, I have to add at this moment that this afternoon, I was at the James Monroe Museum, and the folks there were nice enough. When I was speaking this afternoon to the students, and I was waxing enthusiastic about looking at original documents and how much I love doing research and looking at 18th century materials, and they brought out a letter from Monroe to Hamilton in the middle of that almost duel. A really rude letter, too, that I can't imagine what Hamilton would have thought getting that letter in which, Monroe is like, well, a man of honor would have done this. You did this. So it was rude. And I was, as folks will vouch, beyond excited. I was like, oh my gosh, it's a letter from the near duel. Anyway, the nice part about this is that it is here. And I think it's going to be at the table where I'm signing books. So I will be happily with the letter, but you guys, if you want to see the letter, you could come afterwards and take a look at it. It's something I hadn't seen before, so I think that's pretty amazing and wonderful, and thank you guys for wherever you all are there. Thank you. Okay, so clearly, political bonds are personal. Personal reputations mattered a lot. If you think about this, a great way to destroy a man's political power and influence is to attack his reputation, his character. Character attacks were a powerful and very popular political tool, and the press was all too happy to spread these character attacks. In their efforts to obliterate their opponents, partisan newspapers went to extremes, willing to do or say almost anything to save the fragile new republic. by, of course, promoting their own cause and crushing the living daylights out of their opponents. So here's an example. This is actually one of my favorite newspaper tricks from the period. And it dates to the presidential election of 1800, when Federalists were panicked at the idea that Jefferson would become president of the United States. So some Federalist newspapermen come up with a brilliant ploy to defeat Jefferson. They announce in their newspapers that Jefferson had died. That's like brilliant, right? Oh, tragedy, Jefferson has died. Now, communication was not an easy thing in this time period. It's not like they could go on TV and announce, of course he's alive. Here he is, standing right here. Roads were bad, mail got stolen all the time. It was really easy to spread rumors. It was really hard to refute them. And so for a week or two, there are letters between people saying, tragedy! Jefferson has died! Who would have thought? And there's a lot of scampering around and people writing letters to calm everybody down. That's a brilliant newspaper trick. So clearly, politics in this period could be dirty, rotten, and nasty. Now, of course, we know the outcome of this nasty decade of politics. The Federalists end up losing control of the national government to the Republicans in the presidential election of 1800, and they never regained much national political strength thereafter. And a central reason for their loss was that despite their dirty, nasty politicking, they often were saying dirty, nasty things about Republicans to each other. As one Federalist put it in 1800, have our party shown that they possess the necessary skill and courage to deserve to be continued to govern? What have they done? They write private letters. To whom? To each other. But they do nothing to give a proper direction to the public mind. Federalists were never entirely comfortable with broad, ongoing, popular political involvement in the political process. They felt that essentially people should vote and then step out of the way until the next election when they could decide who should be in office. And this was one of the major issues under debate in the 1790s. The degree to which the American people should really be involved in the political process above and beyond voting at elections. How much popular politicking was safe in a republic? No one knew. It was the Republicans who were more in step with the evolving politics of the new nation. They were much more comfortable with popular politicking. It was a central part of their ideology. They were better with newspapers. They had more of them. They were better at what today we might call getting out the vote. Not surprisingly for the Federalists, given the direction that politics was going, their status on the national stage during this period became increasingly grim. Uncomfortable with mass popular politics, they were just out of step with the times. Now, some Federalists clung to hope. Yale actually was a bastion of federalism. Connecticut was like the last Federalist holdout, and Yale was the last Federalist holdout of Connecticut for part of the 19th century. I had a student once write a paper for me, and he found in the library student notebooks taking notes from a lecture from 1801 or 1802 or something like that, which is amazing. And it was what he wrote his paper on was, I think it was a class in rhetoric, and the president of the college, President Dwight, apparently in this class would offer a rhetorical situation and offer it to the students, and they would write the situation down and then try and decide what to say in response to it. But Dwight, who was an utter hyper-Federalist, used that class to kind of indoctrinate the students. So he would say things like, okay, class, imagine that a crazed, rabid, French-loving, atheist man is president. And the students write in their notebook, crazed, atheist, French. So Yale was really trying to sort of prop up the Federalist cause. It didn't really work. And some Federalists could see the way the wind was blowing. As one put it in 1805, it's time to leave the pumps and take to the longboat. An entry in Noah Webster's dictionary does a great job of summing up the Federalist point of view in the early 19th century. Webster defined the word virtue as, quote, strength, bravery, valor, and then added, meaning obsolete. Ultimately, this was the lesson of the chaos of the 1790s, the lesson that both Federalists and Republicans learned about politicking in the new republic. The game of politics could be won, by the party that best guided public opinion. In a republic, public opinion mattered most of all. And the 1790s was the period in which this basic fact was being figured out. Even as they flailed away at each other in desperate times, using desperate measures, leading Federalists and Republicans knew that it was the public that had the ultimate power. No one could really predict what this meant. No one knew what the American experiment, how it would progress. But the most complicating factor about the period's political warfare was that it wasn't taking place in isolation. It was unfolding before the American people, who would ultimately decide who would win and who would lose. Thank you very much. Now, I am very happy to answer questions if folks have questions. No questions at all? Oh, a question. Thank you very much.
It seems that our national politics are most divisive and the country somewhat adrift, struggling with the new situation.
A microphone handy.
Given the
I don't think it's on.
No, now it is.
Oh, now it is?
given the end of the Cold War, the relative stability we had after that for a very short period of time. Now the rise of China, a large population, a population that has quite a few needs that cannot be met without going deeper into debt. Are we looking at a period of we are adrift, the anchor's been pulled, and that's what's contributing to the divisiveness within the nation?
That's a really good question. And speaking as a historian, so taking the really long view, and particularly given the book that I just finished, which has a lot of it is about the 1850s, there are moments, I mean, politics can be contentious and divisive all at various moments, but there are some moments when it's really clear, I think, that Americans feel that some major decision or pathway is being, something's going to happen that's really going to affect the direction of where the nation is going. The 1790s that I just talked about was one of them, which is why the politics in that period is extreme and nasty and divisive and angry and sometimes violent. The 1850s is another one, when the issue, of course, is slavery, the future of slavery. The 1960s is another one, when it was civic rights, social rights, and different visions of the nation and what the nation was going to be. And we're in another one now, I really do think. It makes sense that during those kinds of moments, kind of as I was discussing in this talk, people begin to fear, like, what's going to happen next, and they begin to think that the other side is just out for no good and that only they know what's best for the republic, and politics becomes angrier and more violent. I mean, all of that, there's a logic to that. So that doesn't mean that every time it happens it's exactly the same, but I think that kind of dynamic goes on in all of those moments, and that's part of what I think is happening now, and it's happened in different ways before. More questions? Oh, here comes a mic.
I'm interested in this sense of such personal responsibility. If so much is built on personal reputation on the one hand, and then, say, a citizen or senator or whatever's responsibility of, oh, if I sit next to George Washington, right, really thinking through those ramifications. I think we've moved beyond that, right?
Yes.
Let's clear that we're good on that. And was it scale, the scale of our republic that moved us at some point beyond that sense of personal responsibility? Once you get so many people both governing and being governed, where it's not an intimate world, is that what changed?
Well, for sure, that's a part of it. And the country grows really quickly right? There are new states increasingly in the 19th century being added at a pretty quick pace. So the nation is growing, and you're absolutely right. There, in 1800, I remember seeing a letter from one, I don't even remember what party they were, but from one politician to another. And he says, there are 135 electors, presidential electors in the Electoral College. You go in that direction and take 70, and I'll go in this direction and take 60, and I'll meet you in 3 weeks, and we'll be able to talk to all of them and persuade them to do what we want them to do. That's a pretty small world, but you're absolutely right that as the nation grows, it's not as intimate. The other thing that changes is having a political party and being part of an organized team. It's not so much you, Mr. Thus and Such. It's, oh, I'm just with these other players. So it's no longer you individually. It's more like your team. And there's still, I mean, my second book, the one about Congress, you can still see the ways in which they're using the personal to play at the political game. The book talks a lot about how Southerners in Congress knew that they were more comfortable with dueling than Northerners were, and they used that to kind of bully Northerners into shutting up and sitting down in Congress, right? So the personal reputation still mattered, but the entire political game was very different. And you're right, that some of it's scale, and some of it, I think political parties made a huge difference. Question? Oh, yes.
Question about, thanks. I had a question about what would be an example of some of the most outrageous activities between Federalists and Republicans on the floor of the Senate or the House at the time.
Oh, okay. So the violence that I talk about really begins to break out in the 1830s. I think that partly has to do with the press. When I started the project that I just finished and that was published, I was sort of reading my way through different moments in time, and it was very clear that something happened in the 1830s that made politicians, particularly congressmen, really sort of tense and worried about what it would look like, what they did would look like. And part of that has to do with the press becoming more sophisticated and technology, meaning that what they're doing can be seen much more quickly, and that actually increases the violence because it changes the tone. But that doesn't mean, as you're suggesting, that it was all, roses before that point. A particularly famous ugly moment in Congress takes place in 1798. It's actually the cover of my book, Affairs of Honor, and it's between a Federalist and a Republican, and they're tossing personal insults back and forth at each other over politics, but they're being personal. And finally, the Federalist, who's from Connecticut, of course, picks up his cane to cane the Republican, and the Republican grabs the fireplace tongs to attack back, and they're going at each other with the cane and the tongs. There's the image, a sort of pseudo-cartoon that's sketched of that moment, very famous one, that it's in Affairs of Honor, and the cover's based on it. What it shows is these two men clubbing each other, and then a big circle of congressmen laughing in the background, like, oh, look what they're doing. But that was an ugly moment, and it had an impact, and people around the country, particularly Federalists, hit him again, hit him again. They were very sort of engaged in that particular moment. It meant something to people. So violence was possible. It just wasn't routine in that period. The question over here.
Thank you. So you made the clear parallels between back then and today. Well, we reached that era of good feelings with the election of Monroe. Could you sort of talk a little bit about that, and then maybe project how that might connect to today?
Okay, the era of good. Well, okay, so one of the things that happens is that Jefferson is elected president. At first, the Federalists say, okay, there's actually a little honeymoon moment where they're like, okay, let's just see. Jefferson during his inaugural address says, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. That doesn't last forever, but there's a brief moment. But the Federalists are kind of dying down. So for one thing, part of what happens is you no longer have the Federalists and the Republicans going at each other. The Republicans ultimately begin to go at each other, but the nature of politics changes. And that moment of change is just less clear that it's one side versus another side. It becomes more complex. When parties splinter, sometimes that's a moment when things are happening, but not necessarily a moment of X versus Y kind of intensity. So that's part of what happens in that period. Later, when you get to Andrew Jackson and the rise of the Democratic Party, when actually, once again, then you get Democrats and Whigs and organized parties and a new kind of party politics that's like a team sport and, slogans and all things that now we assume are normal in politics, but that hadn't been there before, that ups the nature of violence again. So it's partly a question of who is engaged in the political game and partly a question of how the political game is working.
Is it also measurable to a degree the effect that perception of an external enemy or an external threat has on either muting or setting aside the inter-party or internecine sort of, okay. Is there a measurable impact of the perception of an external threat that, say, put away the gloves for a while among each other and let's concentrate on this outside threat, and then once it's over, let's get back to it?
Yeah, no, for sure. When there's an outside threat, the people who are out of power are in a difficult situation because they still want to fight to get what they want, but fighting at a moment like that does not look good. So in the late 1790s, during the quasi-war with France, the Republicans are in a sticky situation because they're angry and they want to do what they want to do, but they can't pipe up because it will look unpatriotic, and and thus the Federalists are able to do all kinds of scary things in that period because the Republicans can't say much. Reverse is true when you get later on the Hartford Convention under Jefferson. You get the Federalists who are like, we hate what's going on in America. We're going to secede from the Union. And the fact that they're doing that at a moment where it feels as though there's an outside threat, that really basically doesn't serve their reputations very well, and they're sort of for all time cursed for just piping up. So you're absolutely right that an outside threat shapes things, and that the people who don't have power in that moment, I think, are in a particularly sticky situation. But the other thing that it does is sometimes it unites the people, right? So during the quasi-war with France, the Republicans kind of aren't sure how to proceed, but the American people are kind of, boo France, France is evil. They asked for a bribe. We hate France. And John Adams, who was never an intensely popular individual, right? I have very fond feelings for John Adams, but he's like this crotchety, insecure guy. But when he's president during the quasi-war, the American public is like cheering him wherever he goes, and he's loving it, right? He's like, this is the best thing ever. Like, the public is cheering. The public unites. But I think it's the people who don't hold power that are in a difficult situation at those moments. What do you do? And that's not an easy answer for that.
Yes, I was wondering.
The microphone is traveling to you.
Thank you. Well, I was not expect that. My apologies. I was wondering, is it common to sort of see people in this era with all these personal attacks, sort of, as we would say today, call out the ad hominem and basically say, hey, look, you shouldn't be taking this to a personal level. Listen to what I'm saying logically. Like, how often do we see that I know I at least personally see a lot today?
Well, one way of looking at that is to look at Congress, where they're, in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, when they're smacking away at each other and Southerners are saying horrible things about Northerners. Inevitably, there's someone who stands up and says, but the rules, we should not be doing this. The protocol of Congress says we should not be doing this, right? This is we should be civil. We should be engaged with each other. John Quincy Adams, who's in Congress for part of that period, he calls those moments lamentation speeches. Like in his diary, he'll be like, oh, now the lamentation speeches are starting. Everyone's going to be like, no, the rules. And the fact of the matter is, although everyone knows that that's how people should act, they're not acting that way. And in part, because it involves both party and personal reputation, it's very hard to not be engaged in that kind of behavior. There's an episode I write about in the book. It's a duel that two congressmen fight who like each other fine. They don't even hate each other. They don't dislike each other. They get sucked into it because of party politics, and they can't find their way out. So there's a way in which, even though party politics makes things easier, there's a way in which you could twist it, if you want to twist it, so that the personal component still has power, which of course we do see today. So as you're suggesting, sometimes you manage to have someone who has a strong enough voice that they say, we shouldn't be doing this, and then you find someone with a strong enough voice who's doing it anyway. So I think that's kind of an ongoing problem of partisan politics. Sure. Are there any other questions? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
If you're a little shy and still want to ask a question of Dr. Freeman, you'll have a chance while you're buying the books and other things that we have for sale. And we have some refreshments as well. I want to remind you that the year is not done as far as programming from the James Monroe Museum. We have our holiday open house coming up. We have the Deck the Halls program, which is usually in here, but it's going to be at the Hurley Convergence Center this year. But go to jamesmonroemuseum.org. You can see that and other programming and resources at our website. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you out there in Computerland. And we look forward to seeing you again.